a major honor to have been invited to participate in this annual meeting of Jewish Voice for Peace. And let me once again thank Ari, whom I've known for many, many years, the years during which he was actively working. He's still actively working for Critical Resistance, but he was on the staff of Critical Resistance. I'd also like to say how much I appreciate the work of Rebecca Vilkomas, whom I met recently at the National Women's Studies Association conference, where we had the opportunity to speak before a huge crowd. And at the conclusion of our presentation, out of the perhaps 1,500 people who were there, 10 did not stand up to say that they wanted the NWSA to pass a resolution endorsing VDS. Not waiting. Of course, the overarching theme of this wonderful conference, which is unfortunately coming to a conclusion today. And I think the theme dramatically captures the urgencies of this present conjuncture. Everywhere there are signs that people want change. People are dissatisfied with the state of the world. People are tired of waiting for an end to racism, economic injustice, the continued effects of colonialism. People are tired of waiting for an end to the occupation of Palestine. But as long as we do not assume responsibility for accelerating the processes that will bring about change, we will always be waiting. And so I wholeheartedly embrace this theme. We must act now. We cannot wait. I am extremely happy that Jewish Voice for Peace is emerging as one of the most important progressive organizations in the country. An organization that is reclaiming the legacy of Jewish leadership of and participation in struggles for peace, racial justice, and, oh yes, socialism. Justice is never static. It is always evolving. Those of us who have had the privilege of witnessing the evolution of social justice struggles over the last several decades can attest to the fact that what looked like justice 40 years ago has become far more capacious and infinitely more complex. We have also learned that we cannot live on the laurels of the past. Veteran civil rights leaders who, for example, refused to embrace struggles for LGBTQ justice have failed to understand the implications of their own activism. Those who fought against racism and anti-Semitism but failed to recognize the extent to which anti-Arab racism and Islamophobia have transformed the very terrain of our struggles against racism do not understand the importance of the intersectionality of justice struggles. As it has been repeatedly declared in the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., justice is always invisible. We cannot call for justice for some without calling for justice for all. We cannot call for an end to anti-Semitism without calling for an end to the occupation of Palestine. For justice in South Africa in the past should be willing to call for justice in Palestine today. In 2015, Palestine is our South Africa.
That's right.
Like the anti-apartheid movement of the latter 20th century, the Justice for Palestine movement can not only lead to a political transformation in Palestine, Israel, but can also radically transform our movements. That is to say, globalize our social justice movements here at home. Racism is not simply a domestic problem. Homophobia is not simply a domestic problem. Involvement in the struggle for a free Palestine can radically transform our collective consciousness regarding our struggles for justice here at home. I am aware that this is the last plenary of the conference, and that it is my job to try to inspire you to return to your various communities with renewed strength and determination. And I don't know whether I have to do that, because it seems that you've been inspired over the last few days already. But what I do know is that I can try to let you know why I think this collective strength and collective determination are more important now than ever before. Those of us who identify as activists know the joys and frustrations of organizing. Many of us think we know what should be on the agendas of progressive individuals and organizations. And we're often frustrated that it takes so long for ideas to be transformed into action. But we also know that the emergence of powerful movements does not simply depend on the will of justice-loving organizers and activists. If that were the case, we would be living in a very different world today. If that were the case, capitalism would have long since ceased to exist. Settler colonialism would have been defeated. Our societies would have been purged of racism, anti-Semitism, homophobia, misogyny, and the people of Palestine would be free. The emergence of movements requires a certain convergence of conditions. And of course, some of these conditions are created by the dedicated work of activists over time, sometimes over years and decades. The uproar against racist state violence today does not so much reflect, as some people think, a rise in police and vigilante killings of young Black and Latino people. This has been going on forever. The Michael Brown and Eric Garner cases would not have been so widely publicized if people had been willing to forget Trayvon Martin. And if there were not a movement against racist state violence, we would not know that in the last few days alone, Tony Robinson was killed in Madison, Wisconsin, and Anthony Hill was killed in Atlanta. While it is extremely important that the emergence of a movement against racist state violence has created greater visibility of this violence, which is not only directed against young black and brown men, but against women as well. And I think we're beginning to understand the degree to which intellectually or mentally disabled people, especially women of color, have been so aggressively assaulted by the police. But let me go back a couple of years. Maybe some of you remember the case of Kimani Gray in Brooklyn. And I think that was about 2 years ago when that happened. I happened to be in Brussels, Belgium, participating in the last session of the Brussels Tribunal on Palestine. And I was watching coverage of the protest in Brooklyn and the police assaults on the protest. And I was struck by the offhand remark of a very young protester, a young black man. He looked like he was maybe 17, 18, 19. I don't know, you can't tell. You know, the older you get, the harder it is. Everybody looks young. but in any event, I was struck by the remarks he made when interviewed by a television journalist. He said, "This feels like Palestine. This is just like Palestine." And that was a moment that slipped through the media. The attempt to recognize the parallels and the connections between struggles against racist violence in the U.S. and the long struggle for justice in Palestine. And I remember thinking to myself, this is exactly what we need. This is the consciousness that we need. And a year and a half later, protesters in Ferguson were sharing solidarity statements from Palestinian activists. And shortly after that, they were hosting a delegation of young Palestinians in Ferguson. And soon thereafter, representatives from the Black Lives Matter movement, from the Dream Defenders in Florida, from Black Youth Project 100 in Chicago, from Justice League, New York City, and others who are associated with these rising campaigns against racist police violence. They traveled to Palestine in order to express their solidarity with Palestinian activists standing up against the occupation. I have been reflecting on a point that Dr. Martin Luther King made regarding the importance of a more expansive consciousness of freedom. He called, in the months before he died, for the development of what he called a world consciousness. And I take this to mean today a consciousness of global capitalism and war, of global structures of white supremacy and gender oppression, and of heteropatriarchy and settler colonialism. It means today that we speak back to neoliberalism with alternatives to capitalism. We have to talk about racial justice not only here in the US, but everywhere. Sexual freedom, the ability to choose one's intimate partners, but also the capacity to resist assimilation into heteropatriarchal structures. And so we talk about LGBT civil rights, the right to marry in particular, but also about the critiques of marriage as a bourgeois capitalist institution that has become increasingly legitimized within neoliberal ideologies of individualism grounded in class, race, and gender hierarchies. These are issues, it seems to me, that reflect an ethical obligation to develop what Dr. King called a world consciousness. When he referred to a growing world consciousness, and this was in his lecture on youth and social action, which I was particularly interested in this year because of the youth uprisings all over the country. He pointed out that we should not assume that the structures for this world consciousness will inevitably come from the United States of America. That, this is how I see it, that we might have to emerge from our self-imposed provincial slumber in order to accept the fact that leadership might come from elsewhere. And so I want us to recognize the extent from Jewish individuals and formations within Israel that refuse to assent to the oppressive policies and practices of the state of Israel. We are really indebted to our Palestinian sisters and brothers for the insight that our campaigns against racist police violence cannot stop with demands that individual police officers be prosecuted. And so we have learned how to take on the militarization of the police. Speaking out against the militarization of the police requires us to understand how deeply the state of Israel is implicated in this process of the trainings of U.S. police officers, etc. But also the Israeli military police in occupied Palestine have emerged as a model of how protesters should be dealt with everywhere. And this is why it appears as if we are witnessing the replication of their behavior in a small town called, Ferguson, Missouri, and all over the country. We've also learned how carceral technologies can be used not only against prisoners, but against entire communities. Gaza and the West Bank are the largest open-air prisons in the world. And so this has taught those of us who are closely associated with the abolitionist movement extremely important lessons. But there are also new understandings of the way anti-Arab and anti-Muslim racism have become articulated with anti-Black and anti-Latino racism to transform the terrain of institutionalized racism today. And it is not just that if Black and brown lives matter, then Muslim lives matter as well. And certainly that is the case. Muslim lives do matter. But it is important for us to recognize how racism today is so deeply connected with the so-called putative war on terror that new forms of structural racism have emerged. And in order to understand that structural racism, we very clearly have to recognize the extent to which anti-Arab and anti-Muslim racism have emerged at the forefront of racist practices today. And of course, when police departments all over the country receive grants by Homeland Security to purchase armored vehicles that are very similar to the armored vehicles used in occupied Palestine. The Bearcat, for example, which is being offered to police departments in not only Berkeley, but fortunately the students in Berkeley and the community of Berkeley rose up and forced the police department to send back the grant to. But then we discovered that Santa Cruz had received such a grant. Santa Cruz. Well, anyway. Let me say that it's really important that the Presbyterian Church decided to divest. And I know that the family of Rachel Corey is really happy about that decision. And I can tell you that when I was in jail, that was probably long before the vast majority of you were born. But there are a few who may remember. The Presbyterian Church contributed $10,000 to my legal defense. Institutional memory is very long, so young Presbyterians still know about that act that the Presbyterian Church took 40 years ago. But having mentioned the resolution by the Presbyterian Church, I should certainly mention the American Studies Association. And in talking to other professional associations, we have had to point out that this did not just happen. It wasn't just a function of a particular membership at a particular time, but people have been working for years within that organization, for many, many years to prepare for the possibility of such a resolution. And therefore, the association was prepared for the resistance that would come from some quarters. From the 100 university presidents who signed that letter. 200. Well, 100, 200. Yeah, it's important to be accurate. And then I'm also thinking about the case of Stephen Salaita, who had his job taken away from him, a job that had already been offered to him by the University of Illinois Champaign-Urbana because of his tweets. And let me say that there is now a very effective boycott of UICU. Many people who have been invited to speak on the campus have refused, and now, as I understand it, there is an attempt to develop a kind of alternative institutional structure so that people will visit Champaign-Urbana and engage with the students and faculty there, but not on the terms that are established by the university. That is to say, off-campus events and refusal to accept honoraria by the university. So let's talk for a moment about Jewish Voice of Peace, because I know that that the organization has grown exponentially over the last period. And that this growth is indicative of an important shift in popular political consciousness that is in part a function of the organizing work that has been going on over the last period. And let me say that I'm really happy that there is a student chapter at Brandeis. I often point out that when I was an undergraduate at Brandeis, And I'm not going to even tell you how long ago that was. That was when I first became active in Palestine solidarity. You know, oftentimes when people mistakenly try to argue that it is anti-Semitic to stand up against the state of Israel, I'll say, I learned how to do this at a university that was founded in the same year as the state of Israel. And I learned from my Jewish classmates how important it was to take a stand. People are recognizing that they have stood on the sidelines of the issue of Palestine and Israel for too long. The attack this summer on Gaza demonstrated that as long as we stand on the sidelines, that means the possibility that the state of Israel may become even more aggressive. It was previously the case that people assumed that if this is a question of a conflict, Israel-Palestine conflict, then one had to take one side or the other. In other words, one could not take the side of justice. One could not take the side of the Jewish people inside Israel who stand up as ethically and as fervently as people here in the U.S. stand up against the U.S. government. Even a government headed by the first black president, a government that continues to insist on destroying the lives of people in places like Afghanistan and Iraq. If we can oppose the policies and practices of the U.S. government, then certainly we can oppose the policies and practices of the state of Israel. And we can stand up against the U.S. government for being the major financial and ideological supporter of the occupation of Palestine. Long ago that it was the case that people could claim to be progressive. And I heard Rebecca talking about Peck in Puerto Rico. So progressive except Palestine. But it was also the case that many progressive, so-called progressive organizations refused to take a position. Thus, Palestine was not incorporated into their social justice agendas, which made it so much easier to be progressive except Palestine. It also used to be the case that people could be intimidated to keep quiet on the question of Palestine, because in order to be a legitimate spokesperson for justice in Palestine, you had to be aware of all of the political and economic dimensions of the conflict. If you could not speak as an expert, if you could not speak with the kind of authority that CNN demands, for example. That is, if you had not spent years studying the situation in Israel, Palestine, you did not have the right to speak. But movements for justice are never movements of experts only. We can all be experts on justice by virtue of our identification with global movements for peace, equality, and justice. All of which is to say that we need ever larger numbers of people willing to speak out for justice. After years of being marginalized now, Students for Justice for Palestine on campuses all over the country are experiencing a really important cycle of growth. And that is an indication that everyone has to be urged to speak out. And Jewish Voice for Peace can play a pivotal role during this coming period. You can not only help to further broaden the campaign for BDS. Palestine is our South Africa. But you can help to give leadership to movements against racism here in the US. Jewish activists who stand up for justice in Palestine are particularly well positioned to model what it means to stand up against racism. And for white people to stand up against racism. And of course, I'm not assuming that all Jews are white or that white is a stable identitarian category. Still, white people have to be willing to give leadership. And let me say that, I know that the whole notion of allies is important. But I'm sometimes disturbed by the bifurcation of the real activists and then the allies. I think that that can sometimes serve as a pretext for not giving leadership. And white activists have to be willing to give leadership, as they have to be willing to accept leadership from people of color. This is a very exciting moment. I don't think that there has ever been, at least in my lifetime, there has never been such a growing consciousness of the intersectionality of our struggles. And I use this feminist term to acknowledge the strong impact of feminism on radical movements today. At a time when global capitalism has led to corporate alliances like G4S, which you all know is the largest security corporation in the world, and it links the prison industrial complex with war, with gender violence. At a time when this is happening within the hierarchies of global capitalism, we are compelled to speak back with the voices of our global solidarities. And one of the most important of these voices is Jewish Voice for Peace. Carry on.